The wheels of the stagecoach screeched against the dry, rutted road as it lurched to a halt. Dust billowed around the battered vehicle, curling through the shimmering heat like ghostly fingers. Clara Whitmore gripped her worn carpet bag tighter, her palms slick with sweat and fear. She stepped down onto the cracked earth of Sweetwater, a town so small it could have been a figment of a lonely man's imagination. Her heart pounded painfully as she brushed off her threadbare skirts and squared her shoulders against the gazes already falling heavy on her. She had journeyed too far and lost too much to falter now. The sun was merciless, a white furnace overhead. The buildings sagged like old men, weather-beaten and bowed by the endless prairie winds. Clara could feel the hunger in the air, hunger for gossip, for new blood, for anything to break the monotony. She swallowed against the dryness in her throat and walked forward, head held high, though every step felt heavier than the last. A sign creaked above the general store, and there he stood. Jasper Boone, her intended. He was younger than she'd imagined from his letters, his frame thin but rigid with self-importance. His beady eyes flicked over her once, twice, assessing, calculating. Beside him, a small gathering of townsfolk nudged each other, whispering behind weathered hands. Clara's stomach turned to ice. "You're Clara Whitmore?" Jasper's voice cracked through the heavy air. "Yes, sir," she answered, willing her voice not to tremble. She straightened her spine as she had practiced every night on the jolting ride west. Jasper frowned, his lips curling as if he'd bitten into a sour apple. His gaze lingered on the faded hem of her skirt, the scuffed boots, the hands calloused from years of work. Disappointment flashed plain across his face. Clara's cheeks burned. "You didn't mention," he began, then trailed off, searching for words and finding none that weren't cruel. "Didn't mention what?" Clara forced herself to ask, though her heart already knew. Jasper shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of the growing crowd's attention. "You didn't say you were," he gestured vaguely, as if the very thought sickened him. "So rough." The laughter from the crowd was like a slap. Clara's throat tightened. She stood, frozen, each second another lash of humiliation she hadn't earned. "I need a wife who's respectable," Jasper said, raising his voice as if making some kind of declaration. "Someone who fits the Boone name." Clara bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. "I see," she said quietly. Her hand whitened around the carpet bag handle. Jasper shifted again, already looking away, dismissing her like a tradesman rejecting a flawed mule. "I'll see you put back on the next coach east," he mumbled, more to the crowd than to her. "No need," Clara said, voice slicing sharper than the desert wind. "I'll see myself out." Murmurs chased her as she turned on her heel and walked back down the main street. The weight of unseen stares dug between her shoulders like knives. She didn't dare look back. If she did, she might crumble into dust right there in the street, another forgotten soul blown away by the Sweetwater winds. The boarding house loomed at the end of the lane, sagging and sad. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and something older, something rotten. Clara pushed 2 coins across the counter to the thin-lipped woman behind it, who barely glanced at her before sliding a tarnished key across the surface. Room 3. The room was small, barely wide enough for the iron cot and cracked mirror that hung at an awkward tilt. Clara sat on the bed, the carpet bag at her feet, and let the silence engulf her. Tears threatened again, burning at the back of her eyes, but she clenched her fists and willed them away. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would find a way to survive. The stars clawed their way across the sky as night fell, and with it came a deep, gnawing loneliness that Clara hadn't felt since her parents had died in the mines back in Dust Creek. She hugged her knees to her chest and let the old memories creep in. The cold winters with barely enough food, the men who looked at her with pity, the women who looked away. She remembered the promise she had made to herself standing over 2 simple wooden crosses. "I will have a better life. I will build it with my own hands if I must." Her hands, calloused and cracked, rested now against the fabric of her skirts. She had built herself out of scraps and stubbornness. She would not unravel so easily. Sleep came late, restless and shallow. The next morning, the town was already stirring when Clara stepped into the street, the pale light of dawn glinting off the dust motes. She had no plan, no prospects, just the hard certainty that she would not beg for scraps where she was not wanted. As she moved toward the small square, a group of children darted past, laughing, kicking up clouds of grit. A stagehand loading crates onto a wagon caught sight of her and muttered something she couldn't hear. Two women, bundled in bonnets despite the growing heat, turned their faces away. Her carpetbag grew heavier with every step. She reached for the small pouch tucked into her dress, feeling the few remaining coins jangle loosely. Enough for maybe a day or two. After that, a hand shot out from an alleyway, grabbing for her bag. Clara jerked back, instinct driving her to slam her elbow into the assailant's gut. A boy, barely older than 15, gasped and staggered away, but not before Clara lost her grip. The carpetbag tumbled to the ground, splitting open. A few dresses, worn thin, spilled out along with a dog-eared book and the last remnants of her dignity. Laughter erupted from the nearby saloon steps. Clara dropped to her knees, frantically gathering her belongings. The boy took off down the street, and no one lifted a finger to stop him. As she crammed the last of her possessions into the torn bag, she felt a shadow fall over her. "You always fight that hard for things not worth stealing." The voice was deep, rough, tinged with dry amusement. Clara looked up and found herself staring into the steel-blue eyes of a man unlike any she had ever seen. His hat was pulled low, but she could make out the strong line of his jaw, the days-old scruff across his cheeks, the long, weathered coat hanging from broad shoulders. She scrambled to her feet, brushing the dirt from her dress. "I don't need saving," she snapped, surprising even herself. The stranger's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Didn't say you did." He tipped his hat and started to walk away, boots scuffing against the packed dirt. Clara stood there, heart hammering, watching him until he disappeared into the shifting crowd. She slung the torn carpetbag over her shoulder and squared her chin. She had survived worse. She would survive Sweetwater. But even as she repeated the words like a prayer, a part of her, small, stubborn, and impossibly hopeful, knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And somewhere in the distance, that man with the steel-blue eyes watched her disappear into the crowd, his heart stirring for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The wind shifted that afternoon, carrying with it the smell of rain and something heavier. By the time Elijah McAllister rode into Sweetwater, the sky had bruised to a low, sullen purple. His horse, a big roan named Whiskey, snorted and tossed his head, hooves kicking up little storms of dust with every step. Elijah tipped his hat against the coming storm, his eyes scanning the town with the wary calculation of a man used to finding trouble before it found him. Sweetwater looked no different than the last time he'd passed through, peeling storefronts, broken boardwalks, faces too tired or too mean to offer a smile. He wasn't here for the town. He was here for supplies, a few tools for the ranch, maybe some nails if the store hadn't gone to hell like the rest of the place. Still, as he tied Whiskey outside the general store, something caught at the edge of his vision. The girl. She moved like a wounded animal, stiff and alert, clutching a ripped carpetbag to her chest as if it contained her last breath. Her dress, simple and stained with the dust of 100 miles, clung to her thin frame. She didn't look broken, not quite, but the cracks were there, spidering just beneath the surface. Elijah had seen that kind of hurt before, had worn it himself. He turned away, jaw tightening. No sense getting involved. Sweetwater was a town that ate kindness and spat it back as weakness. Inside the store, the air was thick and stale. Jasper Boone leaned on the counter, trading greasy jokes with a few ranch hands. Elijah moved past them without a word, gathering what he needed. He kept his back to the girl outside, but his mind refused to let her go. "You hear about that mail-order bride fiasco?" one of the men drawled, loud enough for half the store to hear. Boone turned her out on her ear, said she was too poor even for him. The laughter that followed was coarse and mean. Elijah's hands curled into fists at his sides. "She should have known better," another said. "Ain't nobody here got use for a charity case." Elijah slammed a hammer onto the counter harder than necessary. Boone flinched, then plastered on a thin smile. "Just these," Elijah said, voice low. Boone nodded quickly, scribbling the total without looking up. Outside, the wind picked up, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Elijah gathered his purchases and strode into the storm without a backward glance. The girl was still there, standing stubborn against the rain, as if daring the heavens to do their worst. Elijah swore under his breath. A man could walk past a stray dog, a broken wagon, a leaking roof. But there were some things you couldn't walk past and still call yourself a man. He crossed the street, boots splashing through puddles already forming in the cracked dirt. She stiffened as he approached, chin lifting, eyes flashing with something sharp and unyielding. "I'm not looking for pity," she said, before he could open his mouth. The corner of Elijah's mouth twitched. "Bold. Good. Wasn't offering any," he said. "You got a place to go?" She hesitated, the carpetbag slipping slightly in her grasp. "I'll find one." "Sure you will." He let the sarcasm hang between them, soft but undeniable. The rain drummed harder on the rooftops, turning the street into a river of mud. "Town like this, folks will chew you up before sundown. I can handle myself." "Maybe." He glanced over her shoulder at the gaping faces peering through windows, the muttered laughter following on the wind. "But it gets harder to do when you're cold, wet, and hungry." For a moment, only the rain spoke between them. Finally, she said, "What do you want?" Elijah shrugged. "Looking for help on my ranch. Works hard. Pays honest. No strings." She narrowed her eyes, searching his face for the catch. He let her look. "I don't take charity," she said, voice brittle. "Neither do I," he answered. "You work, you stay. You don't, you leave. Simple." Another heartbeat of silence. "Name's Clara," she said finally. "Elijah McAllister," he replied. "Most folks call me Eli." She looked past him, out at the sodden world, then down at her carpetbag, leaking its meager contents onto the boardwalk. When she lifted her gaze back to him, he saw it, the flicker of something fierce, something that hadn't been crushed yet. "All right," she said. "I'll work." He nodded once, brief and businesslike. "Come on then." They rode out of Sweetwater with the rain pouring down like judgment. Whiskey tolerated the extra burden without complaint, and Clara sat behind Eli stiff as a fence post, hands clinging awkwardly to the saddle. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by mist and mud and the long, rolling plains. The storm chased them all the way to the McAllister spread. It wasn't much to look at, a two-story ranch house, weathered but solid, a barn leaning into the wind like a tired old soldier, and a stretch of prairie that seemed to go on forever. The fields were green with the promise of spring, but the fences sagged and the herd was small, barely enough to scrape by. Clara slid off the horse before Eli could offer a hand, her boots sinking into the wet earth. She stared at the ranch with a kind of grim determination. "You'll stay in the guest room," Eli said. "Third door on the right upstairs." "I won't be in the way," she said quickly. "Didn't say you would." He handed her a blanket, ruffle smelling faintly of horse and sun, and something cleaner underneath. She clutched it tight, and for the first time, a sliver of gratitude slipped through her defenses. Inside, the house was simple and spare. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the plain wooden floors and battered furniture. It wasn't fancy, but it was a far cry from the rot and stench of the boarding house. Clara's stomach growled loudly, betraying her. Eli pretended not to hear. "There's stew on the stove," he said. "Eat if you're hungry." She hesitated, pride and need warring across her face. Need won. She ladled herself a portion and sat at the kitchen table, eating quietly while Eli tended to the fire. They didn't speak much. The silence wasn't hostile, just the natural kind that settles between strangers who both know better than to rush words that don't need saying. By the time she finished, the rain had slackened to a soft drizzle. Eli handed her a towel for her hair without comment and set about mending a broken bit of tack. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye. He moved with the easy, economical grace of a man who knew the value of hard work. His face, when caught by the firelight, was strong and scarred, marked by old griefs that didn't need to be spoken aloud. She knew that kind of grief. It had a shape all its own. The storm outside finally broke apart, leaving only the soft drip of water from the eaves. Clara rose, folding the blanket neatly over her arm. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than he probably realized. Eli simply nodded, as if anything more would be too much. She climbed the narrow staircase, each creaking step a reminder that she was in a place she didn't yet belong. The guest room was small but clean, the bed freshly made, a small window looking out over the rain-washed plains. Clara set her carpet bag down carefully, as if it might fall apart with too rough a touch. She sat on the edge of the bed, letting her body sag with exhaustion. Outside the window, the last fingers of lightning faded into the hills. Tomorrow would bring work. Hard work, if Eli was anything like the ranch he kept. She could survive hard work. She had survived far worse. Downstairs, Eli fed another log into the fire and leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind die away. He wasn't sure why he had brought her here, not exactly. Maybe it was the way she refused to break even when the world had tried its damnedest. Or maybe it was the way she had looked at him without fear. He pulled a battered harmonica from his pocket and turned it over in his hands. For a long moment, he simply stared into the fire. Then, very softly, he played a tune so low and rough it barely stirred the air. Upstairs, Clara lay awake, listening. She didn't know the song, but the loneliness in it was familiar. And somehow, in the vast emptiness of the prairie night, it made her feel a little less alone. The first rays of dawn peeled across the prairie in thin, aching lines, painting the world in bruised gold. Clara was already awake, her body aching from the unfamiliar stiffness of real sleep in a real bed. She dressed quickly, braiding her hair back from her face in tight, efficient motions. Today wasn't about appearances. It was about proving she belonged. Downstairs, she found Eli already at work, mending a broken fence rail by the barn. His coat was thrown over a nearby post, leaving the sleeves of his shirt rolled back to reveal strong, scarred forearms. He didn't glance up when she approached, but somehow he knew she was there. "You ever fix a fence before?" he asked. "No," she said, lifting her chin, "but I learned quick." Eli tossed her a hammer without warning. She caught it awkwardly, but didn't drop it, which earned her the smallest quirk of his mouth, almost a smile. Almost. By mid-morning, Clara's hands were blistered and raw, her shoulders aching from the unfamiliar labor. Every nail she drove felt like it would split her arm in two, but she kept going, matching Eli pace for pace. He didn't offer praise, but he didn't have to. The silence between them spoke enough. Respect earned through sweat and stubbornness. She fumbled once, the hammer slipping from her fingers and landing square on her boot. She bit back a curse, hopping on one foot. Eli chuckled under his breath. "Welcome to ranch life," he said, leaning on the fence post with lazy amusement. Clara scowled at him, but the edges of her mouth twitched. It had been so long since she'd heard honest laughter directed at her instead of cruel mockery. She barely recognized the sound. The day wore on. They moved to the corral next, mending boards and tightening sagging wire. Clara's dress, already battered, became a canvas of dust and sweat. She didn't care. Each aching muscle, each bruised palm, felt like a declaration. "I am still here." Later, as the sun dipped low and the sky bled crimson at the edges, a sudden noise shattered the steady rhythm of their work. A low, panicked bellow. The cattle were spooked. Clara turned just in time to see a section of the herd stampede across the far field, a blur of muscle and terror. Without thinking, she dropped the hammer and sprinted toward them, instincts honed from a lifetime of survival kicking in. Eli cursed, vaulting over the fence in 2 strides and giving chase. The ground trembled beneath Clara's feet as she raced after the cattle. Dust filled the air, turning the world into a swirling, choking nightmare. She caught sight of a young calf, no more than a few months old, separated from the others, trapped against a broken section of fence. The herd thundered closer. Without hesitation, Clara scrambled over the fence and ran to the calf, heart pounding so hard she could barely hear her own breath. She seized the terrified creature by the scruff of its neck, hauling it upright with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The herd veered, missing them by inches. She didn't dare move until the dust settled and the last of the cattle disappeared over the ridge. When she staggered back toward the ranch house, calf in tow, Eli was waiting. His face was a mask of anger, fear, and something she couldn't quite name. "You could have been killed," he said, voice low and rough. Clara let go of the calf, which stumbled back toward the barn. She wiped her hands on her skirts and lifted her chin. "Maybe," she said. But it needed doing. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the distance between them crackling with something sharp and electric. Finally, Eli blew out a breath and shook his head, half in exasperation, half in reluctant admiration. "You're a damn fool," he said. Clara smiled thinly. "You're not the first to say so." They finished penning the herd with no more words spoken, the sun sliding away behind the hills. That night, Clara sat by the hearth, wrapping her blistered hands with rough linen. Eli dropped into the chair across from her, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. Clara looked up sharply. "Leaving Sweetwater? Leaving it all? The dirt, the scrapes, the fight just to breathe." She stared into the fire for a long moment, the flames reflecting in her eyes. "I did once. When I was a girl, I thought if I could just get far enough away, I'd find someplace better. But turns out dirt sticks to you, no matter how far you run." Eli nodded, as if he understood. Because he did. "My fiancé," he said, voice so low she had to lean forward to hear, "was killed. 4 years back. Outlaws ran us off the road. Took everything. Took her." Clara's heart squeezed painfully. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Nothing could touch that kind of loss. "I buried her myself," Eli said. "Put her in the dirt and kept moving. Figured if I didn't stop, the hurt would stay behind me." "But it doesn't," Clara said, finding her voice at last. "No," Eli agreed. "It doesn't." The fire crackled between them, filling the spaces that words could not. Outside, the night stretched wide and empty across the plains. But inside the small, battered house, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not healing, not yet, but something like the beginning of it. They sat there for a long time, saying nothing more, sharing a silence that was no longer born of strangers, but of comradeship. When Clara finally rose to go to bed, she paused at the base of the stairs. "I'm sorry," she said softly, without looking back. Eli didn't answer. He simply tipped his head forward, acknowledging the words, letting them settle between them like a shared burden. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a false peace that hung over the ranch like a thin sheet of ice. Trouble came with the rising sun. Carter Blackwell. Clara caught her first glimpse of him from the kitchen window, riding in with 2 men at his back, all of them wearing the kind of smiles that didn't reach their eyes. She set down the dish she was washing and wiped her hands on her apron, heart thudding. Eli met them in the yard, standing with his feet planted firm and his shoulders squared. "McAllister," Carter called, swinging down from his horse with a practiced grace. "Heard you've been having some fence trouble. Thought I'd come lend a hand." Eli didn't move. "My fences are fine." Carter's smile widened. "For now." The threat hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Clara stepped onto the porch, careful to keep her expression neutral. Carter's gaze slid over her, lingering just a fraction too long. She forced herself not to flinch. "You're hiring now?" Carter said lazily, nodding toward her. "Didn't figure you for the charitable type." "She works for her keep," Eli said flatly. "Same as any man." Carter laughed, a low, ugly sound. "If you say so." He mounted his horse again, still smiling. "Be seeing you, McAllister." As they rode away, Clara turned to Eli. "What was that about?" Eli's jaw worked, as if he were grinding the words into dust before speaking them. "Carter's been trying to buy out this land for years. He doesn't like hearing no." Clara looked out over the wide stretch of prairie, her gut nodding with unease. "You think he'll come back?" "I know he will." The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of distant smoke. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the morning sun. She wasn't just fighting for her place anymore. She was fighting for something bigger, something worth bleeding for. And she wasn't about to lose. The sun was just a pale scar on the horizon when Eli rapped his knuckles against Clara's door. She was already awake, boots laced, heart steady. The night had been restless, every creak of the old house pulling her from shallow dreams. Trouble was coming. She could feel it in her bones. He met her on the porch, 2 rifles slung across his back, a coil of rope in his hand. Without a word, he tossed her a shotgun. She caught it clean, the weight of it solid and cold in her palms. There was no ceremony, no speeches about fear or caution. Only the simple, shared understanding that when the world came to take what little you had, you didn't stand aside. You stood your ground. They worked fast, reinforcing the main house, setting up lines of defense around the barn and corral. The herd had been driven closer, pen tight, a living wall of muscle and fear. Clara moved with grim determination, hammering nails, stacking crates against weak spots. Eli barked terse orders, and she followed them without hesitation. They had become something more than strangers now, something like partners forged by fire. By mid-morning, the dust rose on the far ridge. 3 riders first, then 5 more, all dark shapes against the aching blue of the sky. Carter Blackwell, just as Eli had promised, and a handful of men greedy enough or desperate enough to ride with him. They came slow, deliberate, savoring the fear they imagined curling inside the ranch house. Eli stood at the fence line, Clara just behind him, shotgun at the ready. His voice was calm when he spoke. "Stay low. Don't fire unless you have to." "I didn't come this far to hide behind a door," Clara said, and Eli shot her a look, half exasperation, half something deeper, something proud. Carter reined in a few yards away, his grin a slash of white against the grime of his face. "Last chance, McAllister," he called. "Sell me the land, and maybe we leave the house standing." Eli said nothing. He simply set his feet wider apart and adjusted his grip on the rifle. Carter's grin faded. "Have it your way." The first shot cracked the air, open like thunder. Clara dropped behind the water trough as bullets slammed into the fence posts, splintering wood and kicking up shards. She sighted down the barrel, picked her target, one of Carter's men fumbling to reload, and squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared, kicking back against her shoulder, and the man fell from his horse with a howl. Chaos erupted. Gunfire stitched the air in deadly lines. Horses screamed. Men shouted curses. The ranch became a battlefield in miniature, a dust-choked hell lit by muzzle flashes and raw fury. Eli moved like something carved from stone, deliberate and deadly. Every shot he fired found its mark, dropping men from their saddles, sending them scrambling for cover. Clara fought alongside him, heart hammering against her ribs, her hands blistered and bloody, but steady. A bullet tore through the sleeve of her dress, grazing the skin beneath. She didn't flinch, didn't stop. One of Carter's men made a rush for the barn, a torch clutched in his hand. Clara saw him and didn't think, just moved. She caught him at the corner, driving the butt of the shotgun into his gut with all the force she could muster. He dropped like a stone, gasping, the torch sputtering uselessly in the dirt. The fight dragged on, minutes stretching into lifetimes. And then, as sudden as it had started, it was over. The survivors fled, trailing curses and wounded pride, leaving behind 2 bodies and a promise Clara knew would not stay buried for long. Carter himself lingered a moment longer, his horse skittish beneath him, before spitting in the dirt and turning away. Eli watched him go, rifle still raised, until they vanished over the ridge. The ranch fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the living and the low, nervous murmurs of the cattle. Clara slumped against the water trough, the shotgun slipping from her grasp. Every part of her ached. Her ears rang. Her hands shook. But inside, where it mattered, she felt stronger than she ever had before. Eli crossed the yard to her, blood seeping from a graze along his temple. "You hurt?" he asked gruffly. She shook her head. "I'll live." They stood there, 2 battered survivors against a blood-stained sky. "You didn't have to stay," Eli said after a moment, voice rough. "Could have run. Saved yourself the trouble." Clara wiped the sweat and dirt from her brow, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Neither did you." He smiled then, a real smile, small and lopsided and painfully beautiful for its rarity. "You sure you want this life?" he asked, almost gently. "It ain't easy. Never will be." Clara thought of Sweetwater, of Jasper Boone's sneer, of the cold nights, with no hope, and colder mornings, with no future. She thought of the dust and blood and fire, and the fierce pride blooming in her chest like something wild and stubborn. "I don't want easy," she said. "I want real." For a long moment, Eli just looked at her, something soft and dangerous flickering in his eyes. "Then stay," he said finally. "Not because you have to, because you choose to." The choice was hers. She knew it in her bones, as surely as she knew the sun would rise again tomorrow and bring with it more hard days, more battles, more chances to fall and get up again. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and took his hand, rough and scarred and real, in hers. "I choose to," she said. Eli squeezed her hand once, fierce and sure, and she felt the promise in it, the promise of a life built not on pity, but on respect, on partnership, on something like love, hard-earned and truer for the fight it took to find it. The cattle lowed restlessly in the distance. Smoke from a broken lantern twisted up into the endless blue. The heartland was scarred, yes, but it was theirs. Clara lifted her chin to the horizon, breathing deep the scent of rain and blood and hope, and smiled. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. We've got more Wild West tales just like Clara and Eli's, stories of heart, grit, and the power of hope.